Welcome to the commission work session, Monday, May 12th, 2025, 4:30. Today, I'll be calling this meeting to order until we have Commissioner Vasavada.
Motion to approve the agenda.
Okay, so motion to approve the agenda, seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. We have an approved agenda. So we'll move on to our next agenda item, sea level rise and climate resilience briefing with Natalie Weiss. Is that Natalie Weiss, climate programs with the City of Olympia?
Looks like we have a PowerPoint, so heads may need to swivel.
Yeah. Oh, we have them over here too.
Got them
Great.
all over the place.
Okay, I'm gonna be looking over here, so not to ignore you all. Okay, cool. So hi, everyone. My name is Natalie Weiss. I'm the Climate Resilience Coordinator for the City of Olympia, as well as the staff liaison to the Sea Level Rise Collaborative. Yeah, so Pamela's not here today. It'll just be me. And we're focusing primarily on the Sea Level Rise Response Plan and giving you a briefing on that. Not quite as much about climate resilience more generally.
Missy, can you do whatever magic you need to do to get the clicker?
This might actually, because it's a PDF, I think it's a PDF.
Yeah, we use PDFs.
you do? Okay.
Something
Oh,
about.
no, that was me. She said you have to turn it on. There we go.
You got it.
Yes, we're there.
It wasn't on.
It's usually us.
It's like.
Almost always user error, not IT error. Okay, cool. So we're gonna start just with a brief history of sea level rise adaptation in the city and in the region. So we have the Olympia Sea Level Rise Response Plan. How many people here are aware of that and have read it maybe? Okay, great. So hopefully this is mostly a recap. So the Olympia Sea Level Rise Response Plan is our main document guiding all adaptation planning until the end of century for sea level rise response in the region. The City of Olympia, Law Clean Water Alliance, and the port were the main project partners and funded the study. And the Sea Level Rise Plan, as you all know, provided the baseline for what sea level rise will occur, at what rate, what the projections are, as well as a baseline analysis of the vulnerability and the risks that we're expecting from sea level rise. And probably the most important in terms of like action is the Sea Level Rise Response Plan, which I have here if people want to like browse afterwards. It really lays out this work plan and phased implementation approach for sea level rise along the Olympia waterfront. This here has adaptation strategies and outlines specific tasks and responsibilities for each of the project partners. So the Sea Level Rise Collaborative was formed in order to actually implement what was put out in the plan. You can see here just the property ownership of the Olympia waterfront. You can see the port in yellow, the city is in blue, and Law Clean Water Alliance is in red. These are our main project partners, and also the people most responsible for implementing adaptation actions along the shoreline. Anywhere, the good news is that all of the shoreline is publicly owned in Olympia, so that allows us to have like linked integrated adaptation strategies across the shoreline given current public holdings. We don't have to have any additional land acquisition in order to implement the plan. In areas where one of the project partners does not own property, the adaptation strategies jump into the public right of way, so essentially along sidewalks, which is the jurisdiction of the city. The collaborative is also has Department of Enterprise Services because they're in charge of the Capitol Lake and Heritage Park area and Squaxin Island Tribe. It was my fault, but maybe.
Lost the clicker.
But I was supposed to point to it.
Hold on.
Oh, there we go. Yep, there it is. Okay, so the plan outlines 4 distinct focus areas. So the first is Capitol Lake and Lower Deschutes watershed. That's around the Heritage Park area. Percival Landing, which is the jurisdiction of the city. The Port of Olympia Peninsula, which is jurisdiction of the port. And Bud Inlet Treatment Plant, which is governed by the Lockwood Water Alliance. And so the plan outlines for each of these project areas, a specific adaptation strategies, as well as timelines for which those adaptation strategies have to be implemented. So for the structure of the collaborative, it's been a bit confusing about like what the roles are and, you know, how we all work together. So this graphic is pretty much just to help streamline what it is we're actually trying to do. So the Olympia Sea Level Rise Response Plan published in 2019 really like initiated all of the work and is continuing to be our baseline document from which all of the work stems. We have a technical work group that's made up of staff from each of the partner agencies that you can see along the bottom. And the real goal of the work group is to implement things in the work plan and to guide some of these more informational strategies, deal with contractors and consultants, and have all the studies. The executive committee really is made up of one representative from each of the project partners and really guides and champions Sea Level Rise both into their collaborative member agencies. So like working upwards and advocating for sea level rise where, and they also advise the technical work group with different, for the projects that we're working on. What's important about the Sea Level Rise Collaborative is that each of the voting members, so that's the city, the port, and lot, pay into and have cost shares for all of the projects that we're working on. So there's a financial responsibility for sharing project information. Lastly, the Sea Level Rise Plan outlines the adaptation strategies, but it's really up to each member agency to implement the physical strategies. That's funding, financing, designing, engineering. The whole scope of the actual projects are happening internally at the member agencies, but are being, guided and advised by the Sea Level Rise Collaborative staff and representatives. So just went over some of these functions. And now to what we're actually up against for sea level rise and projections and impacts. So let's see. Okay, so first off, we are planning for about 2 feet of sea level rise. So we're looking at the high range by 2050. And then, but we're most likely to experience about 1 foot of sea level rise by 2050. We're taking a more conservative approach in the plan. So looking at the high range scenario as just like being, conservative and looking towards the worst case. By the end of century, the uncertainty gets a little wider from the scientific projection. So most likely we'll see around 3 feet, but at the highest end, we're planning for a little bit over 5.5 feet. So because we're at the port today, we're going to be looking at the port specific vulnerabilities. So this is all in the plan. And I just pulled these graphics from there and added the red squares for, what's most relevant to the port. So this is showing current day vulnerabilities and looking at the 100-year storm tide event. So without any sea level rise, we could see some overtopping near the port plaza, this low-lying area, and then as well as some overtopping along North Point. So those are the current vulnerabilities and also what we saw during the King Tide event in 2022. Another thing that we recently found, John and I, was the port did survey all of the current buildings. So we do know what their estimated height are and can help understand also current vulnerabilities given these extents. So that could be a good resource as well. No, you're fine. I just have to turn it on and off each time.
You guys back there, could you help me looking? Thanks.
Cool, thank you. So now looking towards 2050. So with 6 inches of sea level rise, the vulnerabilities are very similar between these. We really are looking at that 12 inches for 2050. That's our most likely scenario. And we're seeing increasing flood paths and extents coming again from those main vulnerability points at Port Plaza and as well as at North Point. You can next, if it works now, thanks. For 2040 and 2070, so this, we're really looking at the rightmost image with the 24 inches of sea level rise, we start to see increased vulnerability along East Bay. So that's kind of later in the century, and then along the tip there near Swantown Marina. And then the previous places that I mentioned at the Port Plaza and North Point, those are just becoming more frequent and intense overtopping during storm tide events. When you look at the second image to the right there, you'll see the lightest blue is annual king tide. So that would be, overtopping at Port Plaza and North Point every year at the highest tide by 2050. So there was a question about, like, given all of these risks and vulnerabilities, how have we accommodated for managed retreat, or is that something that we've thought about? There was a pretty quick back of the envelope calculation when the plan was created, and just moving the Bud Inlet treatment plant alone, as well as all of the sewer connections that connect there, would run in the billions of dollars, which is, orders of magnitude larger than any form of adaptation that we would be considering. So overall, deemed that wholesale retreat is unpragmatic and infeasible, but we are looking at some more strategic retreat in certain areas and really focusing on these protection strategies in the public right of way and where we're already owned.
And when did that was decided, like 5 years ago or 8 years ago?
Yeah,
through
that
the
was-
collaborative, the beginning of the collaborative work?
That was part of the sea level rise response plan, which was in 2019. So
2019.
about 6 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah. I will say that it wasn't like, it was a pretty brief calculation because it was just so much
obvious.
larger, so obvious. Yeah, exactly, especially with all the infrastructure.
I asked because we did, a lot of constituents, a core set that are really concerned about making sure we're doing things sustainably, environmentally, have always pointed out the issue of sea level rise in terms of our decisions to continue to develop on the peninsula.
Yeah.
And it's been something I've wanted to communicate, like that all the joint jurisdictions have decided that a managed retreat is not feasible, given the economic cost.
Yeah.
But I don't know how much public communications there have been.
Yeah.
Because it felt like I was the first person ever saying it. I'm sure that's not.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a tricky conversation. And there's different scales of retreat. Like, some things will have to retreat slightly back. It's a matter, like, if we're talking about a setback on a property versus all of downtown moving uphill, like, those are very different things. And when people say retreat, sometimes someone's saying one thing and thinking about a setback, and other people are thinking about moving uphill, so it's always a tricky conversation. And, yeah. Okay, so to that point, just because we're not retreating doesn't mean that we're not, doing things that are reducing flood risk for sea level rise. So the next section here is about how we're guaranteeing protection. The sea level rise response plan focuses on 4 different types of adaptation strategies. So people really jump to this, like, physical strategy, like, what are you doing along the shoreline or in the streets to reduce flood vulnerabilities? But the Sea Level Rise Collaborative has really focused a more comprehensive approach. So we have informational strategies. This is, filling data knowledge gaps. We did a recent study around groundwater rise and the impacts to sea level rise for groundwater table. There's governance strategies, which is focused more on policies and plans. A good example is the flood risk reduction ordinance by the city, where it requires higher finished floor elevations for all new development going on in downtown. And then there's operational strategies, which has really been the focus over the last 5 years, where we're doing more streamlined emergency response, focusing on sandbagging. How can we prepare people for, temporary tidal flooding, and dealing with those periodic impacts that are not all that great, but will become more frequent. So let's see. There we go.
Thank you.
So all of these 4 strategies are happening at different times to align with the amount of sea level rise that we're expected to see. So near-term strategies, we're focused on up to 6 inches of sea level rise and have been happening over the last 5 years. We just put out a 5-year implementation progress report or like progress update to show how many of the near-term strategies we've accomplished. And now we're really focusing on these midterm strategies, which is up to 2 feet by 2050. This is where a lot more physical investment is going to be needing to take place because of the, significant increase in rate of sea level rise over the next 25 years. And then from 2050 to 2100, the least resolved timeframe, but the most extensive sea level rise strategies from there. So looking at these physical strategies, which we're planning for now with this midterm period, we're really focused on this hybrid approach. So having green infrastructure and living shorelines, green stormwater infrastructure upstream to reduce flows to the Butt Inlet Treatment Plant, raised landscaping and things like that, as well as gray infrastructure, which is some of these raised streets and flood walls. Something that's important to note here is the city really floods from just like rising tides. It's mostly tidal flooding. So we don't have actually so much storm surge or like wave overtopping. That's not such a big issue in the southern Puget Sound. So these living shorelines offer a lot of co-benefits like, enhanced wildlife, better aesthetic value and like recreation, but it doesn't help quite as much with flood risk reduction the way it would in a place like Florida where they have like the mangroves and the intense storm surge, or even in New York City. So the full suite of physical strategies that we're looking at and we're listed in the plan are on this slide and are, placed in different areas along the shoreline of downtown. So to go over, what the adaptation strategy is for the port. What's that? So there's really 2 main responsibilities for sea level rise that need to occur on port property. The first being implementing the strategies on the plan. That's what we were talking about with the sea level rise collaborative kind of like functions and roles is like, it's within each member agency to actually like implement what is in the plan while also ensuring that new construction is aligned with future projections. So similar to what you were saying with, how does development kind of intersect or what relate with sea level rise projections?
And 500 Columbia is a good example, right? I mean, it was built to all the new sea level. It has elevated sidewalks. It has a lot of those adaptations. The building right here,
Oh,
like next to our building,
Yeah.
where Sonara is and the 55 and over apartments, it was
yeah,
very much built differently than
Okay.
say this building.
Yeah.
Or that building.
that's great. I'm not familiar with like
The real estate.
that one,
Yeah.
but I'll take your word
It's
for it.
worth looking at for listeners to see what it looks like in action.
Yeah, yeah. So the first one here is implementing adaptation strategies. So in the plan, there's, as I was saying, there's 2 main timeframes. There's midterm strategies looking at 2 feet and then long-term strategies looking at 68 inches. So again, along with the vulnerabilities in those maps, the key priority here is really looking at Port Plaza and the North Point because we know those are the lowest lying areas and that's where, flood or like water will be overtopping and leading to increased flooding, kind of spilling out into downtown. So you can see the blue line there is really just elevating that shoreline. It can be a berm, it could be an elevated path, it could be a wall, but that's a little bit less attractive and doesn't offer as much, recreational value. But yeah, some form of elevation and then installing more backflow prevention along those specific outfalls. Along East Bay, because there's less vulnerability, it's really just monitoring the shoreline, making sure that erosion is, maintained. But there's no real investment that needs to happen there beyond monitoring. And then living shoreline is also an option along that edge for North Point and Port Plaza. And then looking to 68 inches of sea level rise. So this is out to 2100. The real vulnerability here is the marine terminal and, raising that up as sea levels start to rise. And something that's important here, because that's such a huge investment and just logistically challenge, design, engineering, all of it's challenging, really finding a way to see if this is feasible in the near term before committing to this in the long term. All of that work would be happening, over the next 25 years, is assessing the feasibility of this plan by 2100. And then, as we saw before, East Bay starts to become more vulnerable with higher levels of sea level rise. So there's the blue line that gets added, which would be some form of elevation of the path or a berm or a living shoreline. Yeah.
When you said assessing, you started by saying the 1.3 billion would be the cost just of moving lot, and that's why it wasn't really considered. And so are you, without saying it, are you saying the cost here at this point might be so high that there does end up being a retreat
No.
on that time
They-
scale? No.
In the plan, they costed out all of the adaptation strategies across all of the different planning contexts, or so like the port, the city, and lot, and what it would take to adapt, and it came far below the cost of retreat. So that would include this scheme,
Even in the 2100.
even in the 2100. But, the plan was published in 2019. It's most resolved in the near term, midterm, and like this is looking out to 2100 and
A lot of unknowns.
there's a lot of unknowns. We know that this will be vulnerable given the rate of sea level rise by 2100. But there's like larger fish to fry, I guess, like in the near term. Also, this was proposed given only the current infrastructure located in the area. So if there was new development or new construction, this scheme could change, or maybe would need to change it because there would be either increased vulnerability or new assets at risk if they weren't like accounted for. So this would just be if everything stayed the same by 2100 and the only thing changing was sea level rise. So looking more in like section view, because the plans are kind of difficult to conceptualize, I find them to be more aggressive than what is actually being proposed. So looking at East Bay, you can see, does this have a point? You can see the existing path, the bottom brown line, that's currently at 15 feet. And by 2100 with over 5.5 feet of sea level rise, the daily high tide would only be, or would be 16.5 feet. So that's 1.5 feet above the existing path if you were to walk along East Bay. The king tide, so the highest tide of the year, would be 18.5, and the 100-year flood would be 20 feet. So essentially what we're looking at is just raising that path around 3.5 feet up with a berm and scooting it back a little bit so that the slope could be built, out. So looking out till 2100, this was in the sea level rise plan. And, I feel like it's worth celebrating that these near-term strategies are complete and that we've completed like 87% of the tasks that were outlined. So that includes everything for the port. This was a check mark and we're like moving forward on track with all of these tasks. The midterm strategies, as we talked about, really focusing on elevating North Point, Port Plaza, and then installing the backflow prevention, looking at the shore, monitoring the erosion, and then lastly, looking at this evaluating feasibility and phasing of the shipping, raising the shipping berths. So the second responsibility is ensuring new construction is aligned with future SLR projections. We have 2 tasks on our 2025 work plan that will help all of the partners with this. So the first one is design guidelines for capital project planning. There's other cities primarily New York City and San Francisco, also DC has really great examples of just ways that we can incorporate sea level rise as a really basic requirement for all new construction. So very simply in this graphic, you could see, we're planning on upgrading some part of, the port facility, and we know that we have to change it every 20 years. And you could go to this like table and just say, okay, we need to adjust it and raise it up 16 inches. And we'll be, safer, reduce the risk of that specific structure or investment. So we're working on developing this now, and this will be completed by, end of 2026.
So if City of Olympia, for example, is developing more along West Bay and has those those apartments, they haven't yet had guidelines like this to build into developments that are currently ongoing?
That development specifically is, probably don't want to get into right now, but we have a shoreline master program that does govern this, and the state is requiring and is in the process of making all jurisdictions update their shoreline master program to include sea level rise. But currently, and the city's SMP does have that in our most recent update in 2023 or 2021. So we are accounting for things like this.
So any project that would be starting, without going to that one, but anyone that we're starting now, whether it's like a waterfront center or the
SMP, yeah, the shoreline master program.
Program would be ensuring.
Yeah, any shoreline development is governed by the shoreline master program, and we have accommodated for sea level rise in our most recent update.
So it's currently being, that's why that's a good example. That building had to modify for sea level rise based on the design guidelines from the city.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure, like, I'm not it's run through Public Works for the city, which I'm not in, so I can like forward you to someone who knows more about the SMP and how it like goes through the permitting process and all of these things if you're interested in it.
Well, more for our role in governance, right?
Yeah.
I just want to know, yep, the SMP is already taking care of it, so we don't have to layer on something extra, or actually, we're in this weird moment where you're gonna come out with guidelines that are gonna be very relevant and you're not gonna have them for a year, so we might not want to fully bake any plans until then. Like, that's what I'm trying to hear from you.
Yeah, this would be for when you're actually going to build a specific structure. And yeah,
Are you pulling Mike Reed in?
Well, yes, I think Mike might be able to help.
Yeah, I'll just add a little on to that. So what would ultimately happen in a process like that? So if somebody were to build at along our waterfront over at Swantown, the first thing that would happen is they would go to the city, they would submit we would require them to submit for oftentimes you'll hear it referred to as like a pre-submittal conference or a pre-submission conference or something like that. And that's the kind of meeting that you would have before you get your permits to be able to build. In that meeting, the city provides a review of the project proposal that goes through everybody. It goes through the planners, it goes through the fire department, and they give you real-time feedback for what you would need to accommodate. We attend those meetings when something is being proposed on port property, even if it's being not by us, but it's, so we learn in those meetings real time, what will some of the mitigation be to be required on something like that. My understanding is currently as being discussed, the Shoreline Master Program already does account for those, but even if they were in a place where they're contemplating maybe changing or things of that nature, those do get brought up in the pre-submission conference. And so we would learn about how they would be mitigating any potential development proposal on port property. So that's just a little addition.
yeah, and because part of the issue with the sea level rise planning is that we're looking it's such long range planning, like out to 2100, like this table is going to 2100 plus. And if the Shoreline Master Program is being updated every 3 years, they're not considering, a structure that's going to be there for 100 years, and what does that mean for sea level rise with these super uncertain projections? So these are going to be guidelines that are, I don't want to use the word voluntary, but like helpful for making smarter investments that might go beyond what the S&P would show right now.
Especially if we have infrastructure investments that the timeline that are expected to last a long, long time instead of the normal 40 years or something of a.
Exactly. I feel like this table, this is what we're hoping to have, is this like end of useful life. So you can have it be on the leftmost column. So you can understand just how extreme that investment has to be for sea level rise, given the infrastructure that you're designing for, critical or non-critical. So last slide here. The other thing that we're working on right now for the work plan is refining a sea level rise and flood monitoring strategy. So because it requires a lot of like geophysical data over many decades to actually smooth and understand where the sea level rise projections are going and understanding with more certainty, we're developing more of these qualitative what we're calling trigger points, which essentially says, you know, if this event occurs at some rate and you're seeing this to occur more frequently, then we understand that the rate of sea level rise is either quickening or slowing. Even if we don't have like the raw data to, like the raw monitoring data to make those certain projections. So this will also help us refine how aggressive or not aggressive we need to be in some of these adaptation implementation strategies. So what's next for us? Larger us, city, port, sea level rise collaborative, the region. We're working on our 5-year work plan right now. The plan offered our first 5 years, and now it's kind of up to us to slice and dice what this 25-year midterm strategies will look like. And to make more of a detailed plan, always going after funding and grants, and we're, you know, keeping up with best practices. And then for the port, you all are doing the master plan, which I think is relevant to this work, as well as probably lots of other things. So that's it. Yeah, questions, more conversation.
So how does this interface with like state and federal level science? NOAA, what, are you guys taking the data from other people and then? I guess I'm still unclear on how the city of Olympia lot and the port plug into everything else. This is just it's like a big elephant, right? So we're
Yeah.
looking at this little bite. How does it plug into the larger work?
The data specifically for sea level rise projections. NOAA has their projections that they've put out. Ours align very closely with those. They're slightly more refined because we used a regional model.
So we do our own data creation with this process. We aren't taking data that exists. We're actually.
As a city,
Yeah.
no, we're not.
Okay.
We're not like atmospheric modelers. We're not making
So
the.
we're taking that data from. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we work really closely with the Climate Impacts Group and Washington Sea Grant. Ian Miller is kind of like the sea level rise guru for the whole region and the Puget Sound, and they work a lot with the data products, and we're using like their science essentially.
And so as that changes, we. Make
Yeah,
those modifications to reflect that.
Yeah.
And then you said at the beginning, the money's being split between the entities, and then the different projects will be managed, both the funding and the implementation by each of the different groups. So is it just split equally between the port and the city and lot, or who's?
So the cost sharing is the city pays 50% into the Sea Level Rise Collaborative, and then lot and port each have 25% share. And these are for short-term projects. So for example, we had a groundwater study, and we all paid equally into that, like
Not
for.
really capital projects typically.
No, not capital projects. So we're calling these like short-term informational strategies that are beneficial to all of us, and then the individual agencies are responsible for implementing what we went through with the like physical infrastructure.
And then as far as like you and your team, is that just the city is paying for that, or do we pay into that as well?
For our team.
You, yourself and Pamela?
Yeah, I get funded through, part of my role as the staff liaison gets funded through the collaborative, but
So we pay into
We
the,
have cost share into the.
we have cost share into the salaries.
And in fact, and Commissioner Sanders is our lead, but I've had a chance to participate as the alternate or as the second in the room. And it's very transparent. They brought it to us. And recently they asked us to up the investment a little bit because there were some capacity challenges with, being able to have the right staff for the Sea Level Rise Committee. I really appreciate today's presentation, and I would just, every time this comes up, I tell whoever, but haven't found the right people, that it would be good to now repurpose the Sea Level Rise Collaborative Governance Committee to look more deeply at the financing opportunities and challenges. And I sense that staff don't want to do sort of exploratory looking until certain things have been like fully baked. And I just really would continue to encourage that that's a real good way to use your governance committee, the interlocal working group.
Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, we know we're gonna have challenges funding. We have so many things going on, the Deschutes estuary restoration, the sediment remediation project, and at the same time, they will intersect in some ways with some of the hardening strategies or other mitigation strategies for sea level rise. And so having these come together sort of not as individual thoughts of our Port Capital Projects Director, but rather through the collaborative would be a way to sort of have a unified kind of request as we work through the state and federal channels, which right now feel kind of really iffy, but they'll reopen again. And so we'll just be more powerful. And also it'll be a way to keep all of your governing bodies more apprised of kind of where the opportunities lie. So instead of saying, well, first we're gonna bite off and do more science and then we're gonna start thinking about those things, I'd urge you to start having, even if we don't know exactly what the capital projects are in the stack that are being developed as you start that work project of the guidelines, starting to have at the same time with the governing bodies, that conversation about how are we looking at a financing special district to help fund these improvements because they benefit downtown. But, I know that you had some research, we got to see it, right?
Yeah,
But then your exploration of it disappeared into a staff meeting and wasn't in with our governance committees, the real conversations.
did you want to say something?
Oh, I think it's just a lot of folks are working on the technical pieces of it. And so reaching the higher level policy decision-making for funding and financing, what the technical advisory committee is actually working on, because some of the information we don't get fully informed on. Sure if that helps.
Yeah, I think that goes a little bit back to having some more like internal capacity or coordination around some of that work. I can only speak with what's going on at the city, but like, having briefing and might be able to like attest to this, but like having internal staff do some of that briefing on sea level rise work and kind of like pulling people along.
I think it would also be helpful when just putting on the old hat that I used to wear at the city, that when it comes to conversations at the city of Olympia about financing and finance strategy, staff will go so far, but ultimately those conversations, when they become policy and financial in nature, they will get directed to one of the city's council committees. And in this instance, when it comes to financing, it would go to the finance committee of the city council. And there have been briefings in the past about how, and it wasn't just associated with sea level rise, but broader climate adaptation expenses, and how was the city going to look at funding mechanisms very similar to what you talked about should they be looking at various things from a local improvement district to certain tax levies and things of that nature. So those conversations I think have been had. What it sounds like might be necessary is a concentrated conversation specific to the work at Lot, Port, and the city, where you're getting the finance policy level conversation started. And I'm not necessarily sure that that would be specifically staff. I think that that may be a mixture of staff and policy makers in that conversation. So Natalie, I know that there was the conversation at Finance Committee for funding for climate adaptation, but I don't know how drilled down specifically it got into the sort of capital needs associated with sea level rise.
It did, I wasn't there for that
Okay.
conversation, but we did have the funding and financing report that you're talking about. And it got put on pause, but it is part of our,
Because I knew it
plan.
disappeared. That's
yeah,
all.
it got paused for some reasons that are above my pay grade, but it is on the 2-year work plan to pick that back up and to do the next step on it.
Well, then my request for you as our lead and for our staff would be that in our next work session, that we push to have more of that financing conversation. Whether or not a product is on pause, it exists. And I'd like us to start talking about it.
And are you thinking about that particularly around for projects like our cleanup project or the waterfront center or overall? What's
I think I have what's the word for like a very audacious goal? What is it that people say?
hags or
I have this big goal that we might be, and Alex knows this very well because she has talked to some of the Congress people when she was back in DC, who kind of echoed this, that we are a city, a capital city under siege, right? Or that it has to adapt and model adaptation to climate change. And that we might have a way to then be leaders and develop a more holistic. Holistic is always hard, right? Easy to figure out sandbags for that one
Right.
restaurant, hard to have 3 governments together figuring out what they're doing. But we have something called the Sea Level Collaborative. Like that is the place for that holistic conversation. And I think what has happened is the technical work now has gone on to do its own thing, and people have lost track of why are we convening the multiple governments at this sort of commissioner or council member level. And what happens is we have the meeting and it's like, oh, here's an update on a study we're doing. And I'm urging that we repurpose that to have some of these, like almost our meeting with Tumwater, where you realize, oh my gosh, we have these things we can share and build on together, the sort of co-creative work.
and then ultimate goal being that unlocks federal funding that was otherwise.
Federal or other kinds of tools that we might have to enact together and work
Right.
politically together to create.
If I would add, that is the overall goal of the collaborative, is to have this like regional holistic approach. And I really do feel that the plan offers this unified vision across all of these groups. And like it really is working within these focus areas, you know, the Port, Percival, Capitol Lake, and the Bud Inlet treatment plant, and looking at where physical boundaries are like connecting and touching and linking across. I would also say that we have applied to a lot of grants as a collaborative, and like we already do that unified like regional work. We like applied for the NOAA Climate Resilience Grant across all project partners. We were applying to the BRIC grant, which recently was canceled, but you know.
Yeah,
this-
it can't hurt to make sure that, like I said, I got to be the number 2 to Maggie. And I got questions from people in the community about when different funding reports came out about how that touches, like what came from and I was not able to answer the questions. So I can't feel confident the public can understand if I, as one of the people sitting on it, can't answer the questions. So there's a little disconnect. I think probably the work is really good and exactly what has to happen. And I'm suggesting that probably there's a way to use those meetings to kind of get more of us as cheerleaders for the work to be able to communicate it. And like I said, this is the exact example. Your presentation here is a very nice grounding on the work for the whole commission. So thank you so much.
Yeah, gotta get the electeds excited too. I mean, it's part of the deal, right?
In a nutshell.
No, but I mean, that's what you're saying.
Trying to explain why. It's like, why? Oh, I don't
Because we're all
know.
human
I don't know.
beings.
We don't want it, so it's a good question.
The only other thing that I thought we could, if we wanted to get more insight from your expertise, if we're doing a project, like what would be an additional thing you would suggest that we do if we're raising our marine terminal berths by X number, what would your recommendation be based on the science of the day? That could be something that some consultation as we're looking at really long-term projects or redoing our docks at the marina, some of those things that are not short-term projects, using your expertise.
Yeah, I would say it's certainly not just me, like John is on the
Yeah.
work group and is the main contact for the port. We're also always available, like you've been to the executive committee meetings and generally we always have time left over. So if anyone was interested in any of these conversations, we're very welcome for people to initiate and to offer guidance and, have plenty of time to do so.
We're just gonna get a lot of little boats.
Yeah. Everybody gets their own.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, of course.
I was gonna try and work in a joke about Speedies, which is the sandwich from this place where she's from that's very famous, but I couldn't quite make it happen. Binghamton, New York, so it's a certain type of sandwich called a Speedy.
Yes.
Well, now I'm curious.
Yeah, you gotta look it up.
I gotta Google
It's
it.
pretty good, actually.
Thank you very much for coming and sorry Pamela wasn't able to make.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you so much.
You know where to find me.
Yeah.
Of course.
Okay, well, it sounds like we're adjourning our work session. We'll have a chance to come back again for the work session's adjourned.